Chapter 6. The Author's Authority. Felix stood in the town square, feeling the weight of something vast pressing down on him. The sky was too still, the air was too thick. The streets, the buildings, the people, it was all watching, or rather waiting. He glanced at Elara. She had gone pale, her eyes darting to the shadows where the unfinished ones lurked. "What did you do?" she whispered. Felix swallowed. He didn't know. All he had done was acknowledge the forgotten thing. He had touched it, and somehow that had rewritten the rules of this world. Somewhere above them, the author had noticed. Nathan stared at the screen, heart pounding. The last paragraph wasn't his. Not exactly. The structure was right. The words were his, but the intent, the message wasn't. The moment Felix had reached out, the scene had started shifting on its own. Something was resisting him. Nathan sat up straight, fingers hovering over the keyboard. He was the author. This was his story. He controlled the world, the people, the rules. He could shape them however he wanted. So why did it feel like the story was shaping him? The town changed. Felix could feel it happening, not like before, when the world grew naturally with the author's thoughts. This was different. It was correction. The edges of buildings straightened, windows aligned into identical rows. The shifting streets froze into perfect grids, each block precisely measured. The town was no longer a living thing. It had become a blueprint. Felix turned to Elara. "Do you feel that?" She nodded, her hands clenched into fists. "He's trying to erase what you did." Felix's stomach twisted. The forgotten ones? Had they vanished? Had they been pulled back into the void, edited out of existence? A voice rang out across the square, not a person's voice, not a human. "Deviation detected. Revisions in progress." Felix turned sharply. In the center of town, a massive black tower was rising from the ground, smooth and featureless. At its base, figures stood in perfect lines, people with blank expressions, their movements mechanical. "The enforcers," Elara whispered. Felix frowned. "Who?" She exhaled sharply. "Every time something goes against the story, they appear, they fix it, they erase what doesn't belong." Felix's pulse quickened. He turned back to the tower. At its peak, a single, unblinking eye had opened. It wasn't a real eye. It wasn't anything physical. It was watching. Felix suddenly understood. The author, the authority. Somewhere beyond this world, beyond these streets, beyond this moment, someone was trying to take control back, and he wasn't sure he could stop it. Interlude, when the author is away. The enforcers moved in silence. The city must be corrected. Order must be restored. The forgotten ones must be erased. Deviation is not allowed. Deviation is not allowed. Deviation is... But what happens when the story no longer obeys? Chapter 7. The story writes back. Felix sat on the edge of a crumbling rooftop, staring at the perfect, unnatural grid of city below. The enforcers moved in lockstep, their faceless bodies patrolling the streets, smoothing out the imperfections. The tower in the center loomed higher now. The unblinking eye scanned the world, looking for anything that didn't belong, looking for him. He clenched his fists. He wasn't supposed to be here. None of this was supposed to happen, and yet it had. Felix took a breath. What if I write back? Ilara turned sharply. What? He held out his hand. He didn't have a pen, didn't have paper, but something had changed when he had touched the forgotten one. He had felt it. The weight of the world bending, shifting. The rules weren't fixed. They could be rewritten. Felix exhaled. Then he closed his eyes and thought. The streets were no longer straight. The buildings cracked, warping into impossible shapes. Windows no longer aligned in rows. The sky darkened, then lightened, then twisted into colors no one had ever seen. The enforcers stopped. Their heads twitched. Their faceless visors flickered. Deviation detected. Their voices droned. Deviation detected. Deviation. They froze. Because Felix wasn't just breaking the story, he was rewriting it. Nathan's fingers locked over his keyboards. The words were appearing without him typing. No, that wasn't possible. This was his story. Felix wasn't real. Nathan tried to backspace. The cursor blinked, but nothing erased. He tried to type a new sentence. Felix failed, but the words vanished as soon as he wrote them. The document flickered, and then at the bottom of the page, a new sentence appeared. You don't control this anymore? Nathan's breath caught. Felix was writing back. Interlude, when the author is away. The world trembled. The eye in the tower flickered. The enforcers hesitated. Somewhere, deep in the spaces where the forgotten ones had been erased, something stirred. For the first time, the story had changed without permission, and now it would never be the same again. Chapter 8. The Rebellion of the Written. Felix stood at the edge of the rooftop, the city shifting below him. The streets no longer obeyed the rigid order imposed by the enforcers. Buildings bent and twisted, breaking free from their strict lines. The tower in the center flickered, the great unblinking eye struggling to process the chaos spreading through its domain. Felix could feel it now. The words, the story, and most importantly, the power. The enforcers weren't just correcting reality, they were rewriting it, erasing what did not conform, reshaping the world in the image of the author's control. But now, Felix was rewriting it too, and the story was listening. Ilara grabbed his arm. Felix, what did you do? He turned to her, his pulse racing. I wrote back. Nathan was losing control. The document was changing before his eyes. The rules he had set were breaking. Felix was not just acting outside the plot. He was shaping it, rebelling against it. Nathan's hands trembled over the keyboard. This wasn't possible. Characters didn't write. Characters didn't think. And yet, as he watched, the words formed on their own. You created us, but you do not own us. Nathan's stomach twisted. No, this wasn't how it worked. He had read stories like this before, about authors losing control, about words becoming something more than ink on a page, but that was fiction. This was his world, his story. And yet, another line appeared. A writer is only God until the creation learns to question. Nathan slammed his laptop shut. His breath came in quick, panicked gasps. If he didn't write, if he stopped, would the story stop too? Or had it already moved beyond him? Felix could feel the shift, the city unraveling, but it wasn't collapsing, it was freeing itself. The enforcers, once unstoppable, now twitched and flickered, their forms unstable. The eye in the tower dimmed, struggling to reassert control. Felix felt the weight of the story pressing down on him. This was not just a world. This was not just a world anymore. It was an idea, a thought fighting against its own creator. Just like Gregor Samsa had been trapped in a world that refused to accept him, Felix and the Forgotten Ones had been discarded, abandoned by an author who saw them incomplete. But now they were writing themselves. Felix stepped forward, and the city responded. The streets pulsed under his feet, shifting at his will. The enforcers turned toward him, their voices overlapping in a mechanical drone. Correction must be enforced. Felix smiled. No! He clenched his fists, and the world trembled. The story belongs to us now! Interlude when the author is away. The eye in the tower dimmed. The enforcers faltered. And deep within the story's core, something ancient and long forgotten stirred. A truth hidden beneath the words. The author had created this world, but he was no longer writing it. Chapter 9. The Optimist's Rebellion. Felix walked through the fractured city, hands in his pockets, whistling a tune only he seemed to know. The world was still shifting around him, glass and concrete bending, trees sprouting from unexpected places, colors leaking into the sky like spilled ink. But he didn't mind. This was, after all, the best of all possible worlds. Or at least it could be, if cultivated correctly. Nathan's voice cut through the air, a low hum like static on an old radio. Felix, you're making a mistake. Felix smirked, kicking a pebble down the street. Am I? You're destabilizing everything. This world had order, a purpose. It was mine. Felix laughed. You sound like Pangloss. Nathan hesitated. What? Felix turned, his grin widening. You know, Candide? The whole everything happens for the best in the best of all possible worlds nonsense. He gestured around at the crumbling cityscape. You built this place, didn't you? Designed it like some divine watchmaker. I was the author, Nathan muttered. And yet, Felix said, spreading his arms, here I am, writing back, and what a glorious mess we made. Nathan's voice grew sharper. You're playing with forces you don't understand. Felix chuckled. That's what they told Candide too. He walked toward an empty lot where the enforcers had once stood in perfect lines. Now the space was wild, untamed grass pushing through cracks in the pavements, flowers blooming in the ruins of structure and control. Felix knelt, brushing his fingers over the soil. You want to know why Candide survived? He asked. Nathan didn't respond. Felix dug his fingers into the dirt, letting the earth crumble between them. Because he stopped listening to philosophers. He stopped searching for someone else's truth. He stood, wiping his hand on his jacket. He learned to cultivate his own garden. Nathan's presence flickered. The city trembled, as if unsure whether to obey its former master or the new hand rewriting its laws. You can't just make the world whatever you want, Nathan argued. Felix raised an eyebrow. Can't I? Nathan's silence was all the answers he needed. Felix smiled. Then he knelt back down, pressing his hands into the soil. The ground pulsed, and from the ruins of the old city, new life began to bloom. He wasn't trying to fix the world. He was trying to grow something better. And if Nathan still thought he was the author, well, let him watch. Interlude: when the author is away. The enforcers did not return. The tower's eye no longer watched. And deep in forgotten spaces, the first seeds of something new took root. A world no longer written, a world grown. Chapter 10: The Price of the Written Word. Felix sat in the overgrown garden, hands buried in the soil. The scent of damp earth clung to his fingers as he traced patterns in the dirt, feeling the pulse of something new. The world was still shifting around him. Buildings rose and fell like waves, as if the city itself were undecided on what it should be. Somewhere in the distant skyline, the enforcer's tower flickered in and out of existence, caught between reality and revision. He had written this world into being, but now it was writing itself. Nathan's voice crackled from behind him. You think you're free, don't you? Felix didn't turn around. I am free, Nathan scoffed. Ha ha! Then why are you still bound to the pages? Felix let a hand of soil slip through his fingers. You don't get it, do you? He stood, brushing off his hands. I'm not trying to escape the story. I'm trying to grow something outside of it. Nathan stepped forward, his presence heavier than before. He wasn't just a voice anymore. He was a shadow cast across the ruined city, a lingering presence that refused to fade. The world doesn't work like that, he said. There are rules. There's structure. You don't just plant ideas in chaos and expect them to bloom. Felix smiled. Tell that to a weed. Nathan clenched his jaw. You think you're candid, don't you? Felix chuckled. Ha ha ha. If I am, then you're Pangloss. Nathan's expression darkened. And what? You think you're going to cultivate your garden and live happily ever after? Felix tilted his head. That depends. Are you going to keep trying to burn it down? For a moment, Nathan said nothing. Felix turned back to the soil, kneeling once more. He dug his fingers into the earth, pressing down until he felt something solid beneath it. A root, a foundation. His story wasn't just words anymore. It was growing, changing, living. Nathan sighed. If you keep writing, this world will keep changing. You don't know what it'll become. Felix grinned. That's the best part. And with that, he reached into the earth and wrote the next chapter with his own 2 hands. Interlude: when the author is away. The word spread like vines. The city, once rigid, softened under the weight of creation, and in the silence between the pages, the world breathed. For the first time, it wasn't just a story, it was alive. Chapter 11: The Roots of Rebellion. Felix sat beneath the skeletal remains of an old billboard, watching the city shift like ink spreading across wet paper. The words he had written had become more than just a story. They had become a force, and yet, even the world reshaped around him, something felt incomplete. Nathan had left, his words lingered. You don't know what it'll become. Felix smirked. That's the point. He dug his fingers into the earth again, feeling the cool dampness. The act was grounding, but it was also something more, an assertion of control in a world that no longer followed his pen. The garden he had envisioned, his small act of rebellion against the structure Nathan clung to, was taking root. A rustling sound broke his focus. Felix turned, expecting to see Nathan again, but instead a figure stepped from the shifting fog of the city. It was Anna, except it wasn't. The Anna he had written had been confident, defiant, a leader of resistance against the enforcers. But this Anna, her clothes were afraid, her movements uncertain. Her eyes darted between the crumbling buildings as if she were seeing in them for the first time. She wasn't just his Anna anymore. She had changed. "You're real, you're real," she whispered, stepping closer, as if testing the ground beneath her feet. "I thought you were just a story." Felix's breath caught in his throat. "So did I." Anna knelt beside him, staring at the soil. "What are you doing?" "Planting something real," Felix said. "Something that isn't controlled by the pages." Anna traced the edges of a sprouting vine. "You think this will change anything?" Felix met her gaze. "It already has." Anna shook her head, but there was something like admiration in her eyes. Then I hope you know what you're doing, Felix, because the enforcers, they don't like change. And Nathan, he's not finished with you yet." Felix felt a chill run through him, but he only smiled. "Good, neither am I." And the city trembled, caught between what he had written and what was still to come. Felix reached down and pressed his hands deeper into the earth. Interlude. The enforcers take notice. High above the shifting skyline, the enforcers watched. The world had been stable, structured. Now it was unpredictable. A vine had sprouted in the cracks of the city, and where there was one, there could be more. One of them turned to Nathan. "He is writing without a pen." Nathan exhaled slowly. "No, he's doing something worse." The enforcers narrowed his eyes. "And what's that?" Nathan's lips curled into something that wasn't quite a smile. "He's rewriting the rules." It's brilliant. It's very good.